So, Rabbi Say, we are at the Mishnah on the top of DAF Chaf Vav Amud Aleph. We were talking about scenarios where we don't allow people to marry because of suspicion or rumor. And we talked about Rabbi so-and-so who tells a woman that she has to divorce her husband because he can't find a heter to her neder. So the Mishnah told us previously, when she does get divorced, the rabbi can't marry her. Or we talked about a case where an aide, a witness comes and says, your husband is dead. In that situation, when she goes to remarry, the aide himself cannot marry the woman. So v'kulam, so in all of these cases where there's suspicion, so shahayu lahem nashim vamesu mutaros linasei lahem. In the situation where the rabbi or the witness was happily married at the time when he brought the grounds for this woman to remarry, and then his wife passes away, then he is allowed to marry the woman that he was mater, because the circumstances indicate that it's not that he was, unless he poisons his wife or something, right? But no, we don't make those assumptions. If she died, she died, and therefore the guy's an alman, he's a widower, and therefore he can marry the woman that he previously testified for. Another heter is a situation where the woman goes ahead and divorces or is remarried basis upon the rabbi or the witness, and then she gets married to another person, and then that person either divorces her or dies. In that situation, if the rabbi is available and she's available, then they're allowed to get married, because again, the circumstances demonstrate that this was not a conspiracy. V'kulan mutaros livnehem o le'achehem. And finally, the Mishnah also gives us another heter, that even without anything else, if this woman goes ahead and gets a heter to remarry, she's allowed to marry the rabbi or the witness's son or brother, because there's no suspicion that maybe this was being done in order to allow a relative of his to marry this woman. And there's also no suspicion that maybe the reason why she's marrying the brother or the son is to be able to stay close to the man that she loves, who's the rabbi or the witness. Well, the Gemara will talk this out. The Gemara now says, Meis in niskar shulo. The only time that we give a heter to the rabbi or the witness to marry the woman is if he was happily married at the time, and then his wife passes away. But if he divorces his wife, then we don't allow him to marry the woman, because we have to suspect that maybe the reason why he divorced his wife is because he fell in love with this woman, and that was the reason why he gave her a heter to remarry in the first place, or testified falsely, and therefore it's too suspicious and we don't allow it. So Amar Lei, Rav Hillel Ravashi, V'hatanya afilu niskarshu. But the Brisa seems to dispute that. The Brisa seems to say, Danny, I have to ask you something at the end of the daf. But the Brisa says, but we know that that's not the case, because it says in the Brisa, afilu niskarshu, that even if the judge or the witness divorces his wife, he's allowed to marry the woman. So lo kasha hada havai katata, hada lo havai katata. The Gemara answers, and it's a very contemporary sounding Gemara. If the rabbi or witness and his wife were already experiencing marital strife before this case came along, then you can surmise that the reason for the divorce is not because of this woman. And therefore, the Bryce is justified in saying that after the rabbi gets divorced, he's allowed to marry the woman, because he's now available. Right? But if they were living happily, to all external appearances, they were the happily married couple, and then all of a sudden this woman comes along, and the rabbi gives her a heter to remarry, and then he divorces his wife. So then that's a sign that there's maybe some conspiracy or some suspicion aroused, and therefore he cannot. We would not allow that. V'iboyes ema havaha delo havai ketata. I know a case of a rabbi who was doing a gerus for a woman. It happens. It's happened in the past. He was happily married, but he was doing a gerus for a woman who was involved in getting married to another man, and that was that. Divorces his wife, marries the gerus. Right? It happens. But it's not nice, and therefore
she was married too.
I think she was married too, but not halachically. So she was going to the rabbi for a gerus, so that she could be married to her husband. Yeah.
Wow.
She's a different person after being the guy.
Right.
Yeah, I guess so. I don't know, what was his excuse? V'iba yisema. Another answer could be ha vaha delo havai ketata v'lo kasha. Another answer could be, says the Gemara, that even if there was no marital discord apparent before this case, but it would still be permitted according to the Bryce if he divorces his wife. Why? Ha da'ar gilhu, ha da'ar gilahi. If she initiated the divorce, his wife, then that's a sign that the reason for the divorce is not directly related to this man's love for this woman.
Sounds naive.
What?
That sounds a little naive.
Sounds naive? Yeah, I'm not so sure. I mean, the rabbis are not naive. They'd probably would have to have some knowledge of the case. And maybe by the wife's admission, she initiated it. But when he initiates it, then that becomes too suspicious, and therefore we don't allow them to marry. V'kulan shenisu v'chulei. So the Gemara now says, in all cases, if the woman that was given the heter to remarry goes ahead and marries someone else and then gets widowed or divorced from that third party, she's allowed to marry the rabbi or the witness. So kasalka daitach misa amisa v'gerishin agerishin nema masnisin delo karebi the karebi ha'amar bitrei zimni havya chazaka. So the Gemara's question is like this: there's a machlokes as to how many times you need to establish a pattern which we call chazaka. So is it with 2 times or is it with 3 times? Now, Rebbe is of the opinion that you establish a pattern. We establish a chazaka with doing something twice. So there's a halacha that if a woman is established a chazaka as a katlanis, as a woman whose husbands die, we don't allow her to remarry out of a fear that her new husband will die. And so the question is, how many husbands have to die under her marriage? So there's a machlokus. The rabbis say 3, and Rebbe says only 2. So according to what we're saying, if Rebbe says 2, then it would sound like our mission is not going like Rebbe, because it sounds like our mission is saying that if a witness came along and testified your husband is dead, and then she remarries, and that husband, the new husband, dies, then she's allowed to marry the witness. But if she's already established a chazaka of being a katlanis, how can we allow her to marry according to Rebbe? So the Gemara's answer is lo misa agerishin v'gerishin amisa. So the Gemara says no. You could interpret the Mishnah to be talking about a case where the witness said the first husband died, and then she gets married to another man, and that man divorces her. That's when the aide is allowed to marry her, because she hasn't established a chazaka of 2. Or alternatively, we're talking about the case of the rabbi tells her she has to divorce her husband, and then she marries a second husband, and that husband dies. So we're mixing and matching. It's not 2 cases of death, 2 husbands who die, or 2 husbands are getting divorced, but rather the first husband died, or the second husband divorces her, or vice versa. So therefore, you have no raya against Rebbe from this Mishnah. V'kulan mutaros livneim o la'acheim, and in all cases, once the woman gets a heter to remarry, she's allowed to marry the rabbi or the witness's son or brother. So the Gemara's question is, why is it that when it comes to women, it's the exact opposite? That if there's a rumor that a man is suspect of having some kind of intimacy with a woman, then once that rumor circulates, he's not allowed to marry that woman's mother, daughter, or sister. Now the reason for that halacha, what would be the reason for the halacha? Not because he's usher to these women, they're not an erva to him. If a person has intimacy with a woman outside the context of marriage, he's allowed to marry, right, the graduate, right, Dustin Hoffman, right? Dustin Hoffman is allowed to marry Mrs. Robinson's daughter because it was not a marital relationship, so therefore he's allowed to marry the daughter.
He's Jewish too, Dustin Hoffman.
Mm-hmm. But the girl was a
right.
It's only a movie.
Right. It was. I don't know if he was Jewish in the movie. So the point is, it's not because he's usher to the daughter or to the mother or to the sister, but rather because our suspicion is that the only reason he's marrying the relative is that he can maintain his covert relationship with the woman that he's had a fling with. That's the reason why he's usher. So the question now is, why is it that a man is not allowed to marry a woman, but a woman is allowed to marry a man when the suspicion is the same? In other words, what are we saying? Go ahead, you can marry the witness's son or the brother of the witness. What are we worried about? So why aren't you worried that maybe the reason why she's marrying the brother is so she can maintain her relationship with the witness covertly? Isn't this the same suspicion? So the Gemara says, I'll tell you why. Nashi lagabe nashi shechichan da azlan. Gavri lagabe gavri lo shechichan. So one answer is because there's different cultural or societal connections between men and men and women and women. Women hang out together. Women, especially sisters, mother and daughter, and things like that, they're in constant contact with each other. Therefore, if a man is rumored to have had a fling with a girl, we have to suspect that the reason why he'd want to marry her mother or sister is to be able to stay connected to that woman, because they're always going to be in touch with each other. But guys don't hang out with each other as much, right? And therefore, there's no reason to suspect that this girl is marrying the son of the witness or the brother of the witness in order to stay in contact with the original witness. Okay, that's one answer. Inami nashi delo asron shechivasen ahadadi lo kapti ahadadi gavri da asron shechivasen ahadadi kapti ahadadi. Another answer is very simple for a halachic consideration. If a man had a fling with a woman, and then he goes ahead and marries the sister, and then he goes ahead while he's married to the sister and continues his illicit, covert relationship with his wife's sister, he's still permitted to stay married to his sister. What he's doing is an erva. He's doing an isser kares. But nonetheless, his wife will be more likely to be moichel him and look the other way, because halachically they're allowed to remain married. But if you look at it the opposite, if a man is married to a woman, right, and there's a suspicion that she's having an affair with his brother, then halachically he's not allowed to live with her. Because a woman who commits adultery is usher to her husband. And therefore there's less grounds to suspect that a husband would look the other way if his wife is having an affair. A woman is more likely to look the other way, and therefore we don't allow that relationship, whereas a man is less likely to look the other way. Ihachi, so the Gemara's question now, I know I see a lot of grimaces in the room today, so now the Gemara says, Ihachi, aviv nami, so the Gemara says, well then, I don't understand. Why did the Mishnah only give you a heter to marry the brother or the son of the witness or the rabbi? Why not tell you it's also permitted to marry the father? Why, in the previous price, the Mishnah where it talks about women, it says you're not allowed to marry the mother, the sister, or the daughter. And here it only gives you a heter to marry the brother or the son. Why not give you a heter to marry the father as well? So the Gemara says, Lo mi bayakam. The answer is you're right. The Mishnah is giving you a heter to marry the father of the witness as well. But it's telling you a bigger chiddush. So lo mi baya aviv de bazis bani minei, aval beno de lo bazis aviv minei emolo kamash malan. Because it's no big chiddush to tell me that if the witness is the son and the girl marries the father, there for sure we don't suspect that she's going to marry the son in order to have a relationship. She's going to marry the father in order to have a relationship with the son, because there the son would be too embarrassed to disgrace his father that way. That we're for sure not worried about. But what about what about a father who would have an illicit relationship when his son just the opposite. But what about a situation where the father is the aide or the judge, and the girl goes ahead and marries his son? There you might have argued, well, maybe there's reason to suspect that the father will have an illicit affair with his son's wife, with his daughter-in-law, because the father is not ashamed to disgrace his son as much as the son is ashamed to disgrace his father. And therefore the chiddush is, you're right, we don't worry about any of these things because the concerns we have about women are not the same concerns we have about men, and therefore the Rishon just didn't see fit to write father, because it's obvious. Once you tell me that she's allowed to marry the judge's or witness's son, then kol shekain she's allowed to marry the judge's or witness's father. Let's go on to the next Mishnah. Our old friend, the case of the four brothers, Reuven, Shimon, Levi, and Yehuda. Okay, now remember, we learned about Reuven, Shimon, Levi, and Yehuda. Reuven and Shimon marry two sisters. Reuven and Shimon die, and the two sisters fall for Yibum. We said that neither Levi or Yehuda are allowed to do Yibum. They both must do Chalitza. Why? Because we have this principle called Achot Zekukato. If a woman falls to me for Yibum, but her sister I have Zika with, Zika is considered a pseudo-marriage, and therefore, just like I can't marry my wife's sister, I also can't marry the sister of a woman that I have Zika with. And since I have Zika with both of these women who are coming from two of my different brothers, I cannot marry either of them, and therefore I have to give chalitza to both of them. And our case is talking about 4 brothers, and the chiddush is that even though there are 2 brothers, Zika is still powerful enough to say, not only is Zika powerful when there's only one brother, where for sure both of these women are connected, are tethered to one man, but even when there are 2 sisters that fall before 2 brothers, where you could have argued there's not as strong of a tethering to any one brother to say that Zika is like a pseudo-marriage, we still say Zika is like a pseudo-marriage even when there's 2 brothers. Let's go through this. The Gemara is going to discuss this. Arba achim shnaim em nesun shtei achayos. 4 brothers, Reuven and Shimon, are married to 2 sisters, Rachel and Leah. Umesu hanesuim es ha'achayos, and the 2 brothers, Reuven and Shimon, die. Hare elu cholzos v'lo misyabamos. So therefore, Rachel and Leah can only get chalitza from Levi and Yehuda. They cannot get yibum. And we go so far as to say that if Levi or Yehuda marry either one, then they have to divorce them. It's an illicit yibum. And Rabbi Eliezer, Omer Beishamai, Omer Yakaima, Beisil, Omer Yotziu. And Rabbi Eliezer says it's actually a machlokas, Beishamai or Beisil, in a b'di'evid situation. Beishamai say b'di'evid, you can stay married through the yibum. It's a kosher yibum b'di'evid. And Beisil says no, even b'di'evid, we force you to get divorced. Now, Haisa echas mehen asura al ha'echad isser erva, asur ba umutter ba'achosa, v'hasheni asur b'shteihem, period. Now, in a situation where 2 sisters fall before 2 brothers, but there's already an outstanding erva between one of the women and one of the brothers. So let's say one of the sisters is my mother-in-law, is Levi's mother-in-law. So in that situation, then the only woman who falls to Yibum to Levi is the other sister. In which case, there's no problem of achos zikukaso, because the other woman I have no zika with, because she's an erva, and therefore Levi is allowed to marry the sister of his mother-in-law in Yibum, and there's no problem whatsoever. But when it comes to Yehuda, since both of these women he has zika with, he can only do chalitza. He cannot do Yibum with either of them. Now, Isser mitzvah ve'isser kedusha choletzes v'lo misyabemes. However, that's only true when it's an Isser erva, in which case there's no zika whatsoever. But if there's only a rabbinic Isser, which we call the Isser mitzvah, or if there's only an Isser lav, which like an almana to a Kohen Gadol, where one of the remaining brothers is a Kohen Gadol, so in that situation, we would say that the zika is still there, and therefore it's the standard case of where you can only do chalitz and you cannot do yibum. Haisa echos mehen asura alze iser erva, v'hashniya asura alze iser erva, ha'asura lazeh muteres lazeh, v'ha'asura lazeh muteres lazeh. Now, in a situation where, let's say, Rachel and Leah is Levi's mother-in-law, and Rachel is, let's say, Yehuda's daughter-in-law, or former daughter-in-law. In those situations, where each one is an erva to one of the brothers, so then Levi can do yibum to the other one, and Yehuda can do yibum to the other one, the one that's not an erva, because really it turns out that each brother only has zika with one of the sisters, does not have zika at all, so there's no problem of achos zukukaso to the other sister, and therefore each one of them can do yibum or chalitza, whichever one he prefers. V'zu hisha amru, and that's on that case the rabbis remarked that achosa keshehi yavimta o choletzes o misyabemes, that the sister of an erva who falls to yibum, when both of them fall to yibum, but one of them is an erva, so then the one that's not the erva can do either chalitza or yibum. Let's go on to the Gemara. So Shmami na yesh zika, di ein zika mechti hani mitrei bati ka'asyan ha'li yabim chada v'ha'li yabim chada. So the Gemara says we can adduce from our whole Mishnah that we hold of the principle of zika, like we spoke out before, that each one is an achos zikukaso. Because if you hold that zika is not like a pseudo marriage, that we would say ein zika, so then what's the problem? Each woman is not a tzara to the other woman. They're coming from 2 separate brothers, so they're not tzaras to each other. So what's the problem? Let Levi do yibum with one and let Yehuda do yibum with the other. So the Gemara says, La'olam eimelacha ein zika, umishum dekasavar asur levatel mitzvahs yevamim, dilma admiyabim chad mayis idach v'komavatel mitzvahs yevamim. So the Gemara says, and we spoke this out before, so that's why I'm not spending a huge amount of time on it. The Gemara had said to us, just like we're learning now, that even if you hold ein zika, that there's no problem of achos zekukaso, and really both of these women fall to each brother for full yibum and for full chalitza, there's a rabbinic concern. And the rabbinic concern is that if we were to allow Levi to do yibum to the first sister, the fear is that Yehuda will pass away before Yehuda has a chance to do yibum to the second sister. And by Levi doing yibum to the first sister, he no longer has any zika with the second sister, because now that sister is the sister is achos ishto, is the sister of his wife. In which case he's removed the zika from her, between her and himself, and now he can no longer do a mitzvah of either yibum or chalitza with that second sister. So the rabbi said, out of that concern that Yehuda might die after Levi has done yibum, we won't allow Levi to do yibum. We'll only allow Levi to do chalitza. So that way the zika still remains on him between himself and the other woman, so that in the event that Yehuda dies, Levi will at least be able to do chalitza to the second sister. And then the rabbis went even one step further, and they said, just like we don't allow Levi to do yibum out of a concern that Yehuda will die, even after Levi does yibum, we will not allow Yehuda to do yibum. We'll only let Yehuda do chalitza, because if we allow Levi to do chalitza and Yehuda to do yibum, maybe next time the situation comes up, the first brother will do yibum and the second brother will do chalitza. People will get confused. So the rabbis just banned the practice of yibum altogether anytime you have two sisters falling to yibum from two brothers. So the Gemara's question is, Ihachia tlasa nami. Well, I don't understand. If the whole issue is that by doing yibum with one sister, you're being mevatel the mitzvah of yibum or chalitza with the other sister, then the Mishnah should have addressed a much simpler case. The simpler case is where there are only three brothers, Reuven, Shimon, and Levi. Reuven and Shimon are married to two sisters. They both die. The two sisters fall to Levi, the singular person, for yibum. The halacha should be, Levi can only do chalitza with each sister. He cannot give yibum to one, because by giving yibum to one, he would be mevatel the mitzvah to the other sister. Wouldn't that have been, if that's the whole point, that you're not allowed to be mevatel the mitzvah of yibum of yibum and chalitza to one sister by doing yibum to the other sister, isn't that a much more straightforward case? So the Gemara says, Lo mi baya kamrina. You're right, that is a much more straightforward case, but our Mishnah is telling you a bigger chiddush, that lo mi bayit tlasa devarei batla mitzvahs yevamim avaldala lamisa lo chayshinan kamash malan. So the chiddush is that in a case where there's only three brothers, if we were to allow Levi to do yibum with the first sister, then he would surely be mevatel the mitzvah of yibum and chalitza to the second sister. But in our case, if we were to allow Levi to do yibum, he wouldn't necessarily be mevatel the mitzvah. It's only if Yehuda dies, out of a fear that Yehuda may die. So to go so far as to say that we won't allow Levi to do yibum out of a fear that maybe it will be mevatel the mitzvah to the other sister, that how would I know if I only address the case of three brothers? So the chiddush of our Mishnah is, even when there's only a far-fetched chashash that Yehuda will die, we still prohibit Levi from doing yibum. That's the chiddush of our Mishnah, and that's why it says four brothers.
What about the fact that you're being involved in really building up your brother's house by not doing either?
The Gemara says that chalitza is a viable alternative to that, and therefore, I mean, it's a valid point. The whole theme of the mitzvah is to build your brother's house, but nonetheless, we're more concerned about this isser of being mevatel the mitzvah that the Torah prescribes than building the brother's house. So the Gemara now says, Ihachi. Well, if that's the case, that you're concerned that perhaps you'll be mevatel the mitzvah, if we allow Levi to do yibum, then tell me an even bigger chiddush and talk about chamisha nami. So talk about five brothers. Let's talk about a case where there are five brothers, Reuven and Shimon die, and now there are three brothers. We should not allow Levi to do yibum, lest Yehuda and Yisachar die, right? And yet we don't see that the Mishnah has that concern. So the Gemara says, Lamisa detrei lo chayshinan. The answer is because we're not worried that two brothers are going to die. That far the rabbis were not prepared to go. So taka in achinami, in a case where there are five brothers, Reuven, Shimon, Levi, Yehuda, and Yisachar, and Reuven and Shimon are married to the two sisters, and Reuven and Shimon die, Levi would be allowed to do yibum to one of the sisters, and then we'll let Yehuda and Yisachar do chalitza with the other sister, because to worry that two brothers are going to die, that far-fetched, we're not prepared to go. Okay, so now the Gemara says, now that we're talking about five brothers put on your seatbelts again, because we're going to talk about 5 brothers now in our next case. Amar Rava bar Rav Huna Amar Rav. The following halacha was said in the name of Rav. Shalosh achayos Yevamos shenaflu lifnei shnei achin Yevamim ze choletz leechas v'ze choletz leechas ve'emtzois tzricha chalitza mishneim. So a very bizarre statement. But let's get the case right. The case is Reuven, Shimon, Levi, Yehuda, Yisachar. 5 brothers. Reuven and Shimon are married to 2 sisters. Reuven, Shimon, and Levi are married to 3 sisters. I beg your pardon. Reuven, Shimon, and Levi are married to 3 sisters. Reuven and Shimon and Levi all die. And now you have 2 remaining brothers, Yehuda and Yisachar. So Yehuda will do Yibum to one sister. Will do Chalitza to one sister. Yisachar will do Chalitza to the other sister. And the remaining sister, they both have to give Chalitza to. Now, what is that? Why should they both have to give Chalitza? One Chalitza should be sufficient. So the Gemara is going to ask that question. So Amar le Rabba midika amart emtzois tzricha Chalitza mishneim kasavris yesh zika v'havyi la Chalitza pesula v'Chalitza pesula tzarech lachzer al kol ha'achim. So Rabba surmises the statement made in the name of Rav, and he suggests as follows. He says, let me think about this for a second. The very fact that you're requiring this 3rd sister to get chalitza from both guys, from both surviving brothers, is an indication that, number one, you hold yesh zika, and therefore neither brother can do yibum to any of the sisters because of acho zikukaso. But the situation of acho zikukaso also creates what's called a deficient chalitza. Now, this is a new concept that the Gemara is introducing over here, and Rashi tells us what it is. That there's a svara to say that when a yavam can only do chalitza, but he doesn't have the option of doing yibum, then the chalitza severance that he creates is a compromised chalitza. It's not a full chalitza, it's not like a strong chalitza, because he didn't even have the option of doing yibum in the first place. And as a result, because it's a compromised chalitza, what the Gemara is calling a chalitza psula, it's not enough for this girl to get chalitza from only one brother. She needs to get chalitza from all of the surviving brothers. Because since it's a compromised chalitza, she needs to create a full severance from the entire household by getting chalitza from all of the surviving brothers. Wait, hold. So that's the argument, that's the svara that the Gemara is suggesting now. The Gemara's question then is obvious. Ihachi kamaisa nami. If that's the case, says Rabba, and my surmisal of your statement is correct, then why shouldn't all 3 sisters require chalitza from both brothers? Why are you only requiring the 3rd sister to get chalitza from both brothers? Let all 3 sisters, according to your argument, Rav, none of them can do yibum. They're all required to only do chalitza, so therefore their chalitza by definition is a chalitza psula, according to what you're saying, and all of them should need each sister should need chalitza from both brothers. So the Gemara answers like this: So Rav's response would be that you're right. If all 3 brothers, Reuven, Shimon, and Levi, die simultaneously in a car crash, God forbid, so then all 3 sisters would need chalitza from both brothers. But lo tzricha denafel bezu acharzu. The situation that I'm describing is what the brothers die in succession, consecutively. So first Reuven dies, and his widow falls to Yibum. So naflachada chalatz la Reuven. So we're going to change the names in the Gemara to simplify it, because we've been dealing with Reuven, Shimon, Levi, Yehuda, and Yisachar all along. So if Reuven dies first, and his widow falls to Yibum and Chalitza, so really Yehuda, who's one of the 2 surviving brothers, really has the option of doing Yibum or Chalitza, because there's no other sister. But what we're saying is that if he does Chalitza, that's the case that we're talking about. Technically, like Rashi says, we're not precluding the first brother Yehuda from doing Yibum to her. But it just so happens that we're going to say that he should give Chalitza, or let's say he does give Chalitza to her. Naf le'idach chalatz la Shimon. Then the next sister becomes a widow, and she falls before Yisachar for Yibum or Chalitza, and it's permitted at this point for Yisachar to do Yibum or Chalitza, because even though she previously was the sister of the woman that he had Zika with, but that Zika is off because that woman already got Chalitza. So technically, Yisachar is also allowed to do Yibum or Chalitza, but we don't permit it for whatever reason, and he goes ahead and he does Chalitza, and then Nafla Idach, and then the third brother dies, and this woman falls now before both brothers. Now both brothers have already given Chalitza to this woman's two sisters. In that situation, Achos Chalutzaso is Aser. It's a rabbinic prohibition, but you're not allowed to do Yibum with a woman whose sister you already gave Chalitza to. So therefore, with this third sister, each brother, Yehuda and Yisachar, has what's called a Chalitza Psula. There's a compromised Chalitza because I'm not allowed to do Yibum with this woman. And since it's only the third woman that neither of us as brothers are allowed to do Chalitza to, we both have to present her with Chalitza. Remember, the first two, each one of us could do Yibum or Chalitza because they're happening in succession. And therefore, all that is required is Chalitza from one, in the event that we opt to do Chalitza. So therefore, Yehuda gave Chalitza to the first sister. Yisachar gave Chalitza to the second sister, but by the time they get to the third sister, since Yehuda and Yisachar both gave Chalitza to this woman's sister, to one of her two sisters, neither of them can do Yibum, and therefore she needs to get Chalitza from both brothers. So now the Gemara says, I'm putting a hold on all questions until we're finished with the DAF. If you're scared you're going to forget, just write it down. So now the Gemara says, so the Gemara now says, Nafli chalatz la Shimon, Nafla ida chalatz la, hai mafka zikaso, chalatz la, hai mafka. So the Gemara now explains as follows. So Nafla chada chalatz la Reuben, Nafla ida chalatz la Shimon, Nafla ida chalatz la hai mafka zikaso, chalatz la hai mafka zikaso. So the Gemara explains that the reason why it has to work this way is because there's a compromised zika. Because when Yehuda gave Chalitza to one sister, there was an alleviation, so to speak, of the Zika, or a compromise of the Zika. And the same thing is true with Yisachar. There's a compromising of the Zika because of the fact that he had previously done Chalitza with this woman's sister. That seems to be the way the Gemara is explaining it. That seems to be the way Rashi is explaining it. Like Rashi says, Nafla Shlishis, once the third sister falls, I boy li yibume lo matzi da achos chalutza shneim hu, he uvelo klum nami lo nafka da achos chalutza ein el midivrei sofrim. She doesn't get off the hook completely just because she's the sister of a woman that I did chalitza with, because it's only rabbinic. And therefore, Hilka chalatz hai chalitza kol dehu v'lav ma'al yasehi. Therefore, if Yisachar gives her chalitza, it's not a full removal of Zika, it's only a removal of Zika for Yehuda. And therefore she has to get chalitza also from Yisachar in order for her to have the Zika removed from Yisachar as well. So the Gemara now says, this whole statement of Rav is premised on the principle that there's a Zika, and in order for her to be muteris lashuk, in order for her to be able to remarry, she has to remove the Zika from all of the brothers. It questions the Gemara, V'ha'amar Rav ein Zika, but Rav holds there is no Zika. He was quoted before as saying that I don't hold of Zika, so why should she need to get Chalitza from both? The Gemara's answer, L'divrei ha'omer yesh Zika ka'amar, answers the Gemara, you're right, Rav personally does not hold of Zika, but he's addressing the halacha if you hold yesh Zika. Comes along, the Gemara now says, okay, this is the halacha according to Rav. Ushmuel Amar, and Shmuel says no. Shmuel says, I disagree. Echad choleitz lekulan. That not only do I hold that it's not necessary for the third woman to get chalitza from both brothers, but I'll take you even one step further. I hold that you don't need one brother to give chalitza to one and the other brother to give chalitza to the other, and or to both. But I hold if three sisters fall for Yibum, then one brother could give chalitza to all three. So much so do I hold that there's no such thing as a compromised chalitza, just because this woman is I can't do yibum with, that not only will I allow Yehuda to do chalitza to the first one, but I'll even allow Yehuda to do chalitza to the second one, even though this woman is achos chalutzaso, is the sister of the woman that he actually had chalitza with. But since it's only a rabbinic prohibition, he can go ahead and do chalitza with all three sisters. So the Gemara says, I don't understand. Mechli shaminan le lishmol de amar chalitza ma'al yaboinan. But wait a minute, Shmuel himself acknowledges that you need to have a higher quality chalitza in order for the chalitza to be effective. How do we know this? The Omar Shmuel chalatz la'achayos lo niftaru tsaros. That in a situation, let's go back to our case of where there's three brothers, Ruvain, Shimon, and Levi. If Ruvain dies and he leaves over two wives, and Shimon dies and he leaves over two wives, now you have four women that fall to Yibum for Levi. However, two of these women are sisters, meaning that Ruvain was married to one sister and one stranger, and Shimon was married to one sister and one stranger. In that situation, Shmuel says, if Levi was to present chalitza to the sisters instead of to the strangers, he would have to redo chalitza to the other two women. Why? Because since he cannot do yibum to either sister, it's a compromised chalitza, and therefore it's not enough to release the strangers. So you see that Shmuel holds of this concept of compromised chalitza. So how can he say that it's perfectly legit for Yehuda to give chalitza to each woman only? Each woman only needs one chalitza, and not only that, but Yehuda can do all of it if he wants to. You don't even have to go to Yisachar. So the Gemara says, Heicha dekaima chalitza de Shimon chalitza keshera, chalitz la Ruvain chalitza pesula. So the Gemara therefore says this is like a rhetorical question. So that in a situation, Heicha dekaima chalitza de Shimon chalitza keshera, like it's keshera lachalotz, like Rashi says, lachalotz l'shniya shehi lo chalatz l'rishona. If Shimon, if like the person we're calling Yisachar is available to do chalitza, and it would be a kosher chalitza in the sense that he hasn't already done chalitza with any of the other sisters, we're saying that it's okay for Ruvain to go ahead and do a chalitza pesula? That doesn't seem to make any sense. According to what Shmuel has taught us, anytime there's a compromised chalitza, we tell you do the better chalitza. So why not over here should we require Yehuda to do chalitza to one, and then immediately jump to Yisachar and have him do chalitza to the other, and then we'll go to the third sister and have him do chalitza, get chalitza from both. So the Gemara answers and says like this: "My echad choletz lekula nami de ka'amar emtzait." So the Gemara says you're right. Shmuel will tell you that optimally Yehuda should do chalitza to the first sister, Yisachar should do chalitza to the second sister. And the only point that he argues with Rav is that Rav says when you have a compromised chalitza, she needs to get chalitza from both brothers. And Shmuel says no. I agree with you that this is a compromised chalitza. However, I still only hold that she needs to get chalitza from one brother. If she gets chalitza from one brother, she's muteres lashuk. That's the whole point that he's disagreeing with Rav. So the Gemara now says v'ha kulan ka'amar. But that doesn't make any sense. Look at the language. Shmuel says that Yehuda, the man we're calling Yehuda, can do chalitza to all of them. He didn't just say that he can do chalitza to the last sister. The Gemara says, Kevin deruba gavei kari le kulan. But that's what it means. The Gemara says, Yehuda will do chalitza to one, Yisachar will do chalitza to the other, and then since Yehuda is going to do chalitza to the remaining sister, and he's got 2 out of 3, we call them doing chalitza with all of them. We don't mean all of them, we mean with most of them. That's one answer. The is ema, says the Gemara, ki ka'amar Shmuel chalitza ma'al yaba'inan, hani milu lemiftar tsarasa, aval miftara nafsha patra. Another answer will be is that you're right. What you just quoted before from Shmuel saying that a compromised chalitza is not optimal to the point where if you give chalitza to the two sisters, you still have to give chalitza to the tsaros. That's true. However, that's only true that there's this concept of compromised chalitza vis-a-vis not exempting the tzara, the stranger wives, from their chalitza and making them permitted to go out and marry. But Shmuel will agree that in a case where you're dealing with the women themselves who are getting the chalitza. Then, regardless of how compromised the chalitza is, once a woman receives chalitza, she can receive as compromised as a chalitza as you want to compromise it. As long as she gets chalitza, she'll be muteris lashuk. And therefore, your question was, how can you tell me that, according to Shmuel, it's okay for Yehuda to do the first chalitza and then to do the second chalitza, even though this woman is now going to be achos chalutza, so, and it's such a compromised chalitza? Shmuel will tell you, as long as she gets chalitza, I don't care how compromised it is, she got chalitza. The only time I have a problem with compromised chalitza is allowing a woman who never got anything to go ahead and remarry, to let the tzara go and remarry. That's where I say that a compromised chalitza has to be mitigated by giving chalitza to the tzara. But if the woman herself got a compromised chalitza, I have no problem. Even lechatchila, let her get a chalitza from the brother who already gave chalitza to her sister, and it's perfectly legit. Have a wonderful day. Are there any questions at this point?